Large language models are made up of a couple of components. We'll take a brief look at each of these in turn, starting off with the transformer architecture. The individual components of the transformer architecture are beyond the scope of this introductory course. Let's simplify this architecture by breaking it up into two components. So, the left half of the diagram is known as the encoder, and the right hand side is known as the decoder. We look at what tasks each perform in this video. So we can feed in the English sentence such as I like dogs into the encoder at the bottom left of the diagram. The transformer can act as a translator from English to German, and so the output from the decoder at the top of the diagram is the German translation Ich mag Hunde. The transformer is not made up of a single encoder, but rather six encoders and six decoders. Each of these contain the attention mechanism, which allows the model to focus on different parts of the input text. So this means you feed in the input text at the bottom, and the output from the first encoder is fed into the second encoder, and so on, all the way up to the topmost encoder. Now, by passing the data through these successive encoder layers, the model is able to capture deep and more complex understanding of language semantics. And this is then fed into the decoder layers, which are on the right hand side of the diagram. The encoder and decoder can be used independently or together depending on the task. Encoder decoder models are good for generative tasks such as translation or summarization. Encoder only models are good for tasks that require good language understanding, such as sentence classification. Now, sentence classification is where you take some text, for example, a movie review, and then you label it as being either positive or negative. BERT is an acronym for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers, which sounds like quite a mouthful. But now that we know a little bit more about the transformer architecture and encoders, this acronym should make a bit more sense. Decoder only models are good for generative tasks such as text generation, like I've shown you in the OpenAI playground. So, examples include ChatGPT and GPT-3 and GPT-4. Most of the research has been around decoder models as these can generate text. So, this makes them more useful as chatbots or virtual assistants. All right, so transformers are made up of layers of encoders and decoders, and depending on what kind of task we need to perform, will determine if we need either or both components. When talking about large language models, we almost always reference the size of the model or the parameter count. GPT-3 is a 175 billion parameter model. Meta's largest Llama 2 model has 70 billion parameters. But what do we mean by parameters? Now, the parameters in a neural network are the variables that the model learns during the training process. They get adjusted during training because for a given input during the training process, you want to try and minimize the difference between the predicted outputs from the actual output. Let me give you an example. This is a visual representation of a neural network, and you can see that the architecture has layers. So, a node is represented by circles in this graphic. It receives input from other nodes, it processes it, and then passes the output to other nodes. So nodes represent neurons, and a collection of nodes or neurons is known as a neural network. The input layer has three nodes, the hidden layers have four nodes each, and the output layer has one node. This is a fully connected network. So going from the input layer on the left, this means that there is a line from every node in one column or layer to all the nodes in the next layer. This type of neural network usually makes a small part of most large language model architectures. Each of the lines connecting one node to all the other nodes are edges and they represent weights. The network learns by adjusting these weights, and we can easily calculate the number of weights by multiplying the number of nodes in the left layer and the right layer. So, just having the weights associated with the connections won't give us an accurate result when trying to fit or train our model with data. So, we'll need an offset to adjust any output, and this is known as the bias term. We'll also have one bias term for each node on the right. So in this example, there will be four in total. This means that the number of parameters in this example is 3 times 4 plus 4, which is a total of 16 parameters. We apply exactly the same logic to the next part of the network, which is the middle section, and we have four nodes on the left and four nodes on the right. So that's 4 times 4 plus 4 for the bias term, and so that's a total of 20. And finally, we have 4 times 1 plus 1 for the final part of the neural network. So this means if we sum up all of the parameters across this neural network, we get 41 parameters. So we say that this is a 41 parameter model. Now, to give you a sense of perspective, most large language models have several billion parameters. A large language model would also have different types of layers with different components. I've just shown you how you'd calculate the parameter count for a fully connected network. All right, so we've learned that parameters in a neural network are the variables that the model learns during the training process, and they get adjusted during this process. We've also looked at how to calculate the parameter count for a fully connected network. Go ahead and Google neural network, and you should see a whole load of images that look similar to this one. Now try and calculate the parameter count for some of these neural networks. Large language models generate text word by word, right? Not quite. They generate tokens. So, what are tokens? Basically, each word is split into subwords, and one token corresponds to around 4 characters of text. Let's head over to the OpenAI website to get a good visual example of what tokens are. So, this is the tokenizer on the OpenAI website. So, let me just go ahead and scroll down a bit. I'm going to go ahead and enter some text into the tokenizer. So, tokenization is the process of splitting words into smaller chunks or tokens. Each of the different colors corresponds to a token. So, in general, you can see that most words correspond to tokens, which includes the space in front of the word. There are a couple of exceptions. For example, the word tokenization is made up of 2 tokens, token and ization. The sentence I've typed has 12 words. Now, this corresponds to 14 tokens or 77 characters. And you can see that the full stop right at the end has its own individual token. All right, so now that we know that tokens are made up of subwords, let's take a look at context windows. When having a conversation with a large language model, how can you figure out how much of the conversation it remembers? That's what context windows are all about. Now, if you remember, a prompt is the text you input into the model, and it's made up of a couple of tokens. The completion is the text outputted from the model, which also makes up a couple of tokens. The sum of the tokens of the prompt and the completions is known as the context window or context length. Now, the longer the context length, the more information or background the model has for generating a response. For a language model to produce a more meaningful and relevant response, it needs to be able to take an entire conversation into consideration. Now, different large language models will have different context lengths. ChatGPT currently has a context length of around 4,000 tokens. GPT-4 has 8,000 tokens. GPT-4 32K has 32,000 tokens. Now, with a context length of 32,000 tokens, you could provide almost 50 pages of text as input to a model and get it to summarize it. Alternatively, you can get it to generate more text if you wanted to create a short story. Claude 2, a large language model from Anthropic, has a context window of 100,000 tokens. Now, what can you do with a context length of 100,000 tokens? Let's take a children's novel like the 50,000 word Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. Now, with 50,000 words, this will fit into Anthropic's 100,000 token context window. So let me go ahead and copy the entire novel. Now, the question is, can we get a large language model to answer a specific question about this novel? So let's head over to Anthropic's Playground to see how this works. So I'm now in Anthropic's Playground and I have access to the Claude 2 model. Now, before I do anything, I want to query Anthropic's model about my question. I want to make sure that if Claude 2 answers the question, it isn't in relation to Black Beauty. So the question is, who is Duchess? Rephrase. So you can see the response back is Duchess was a character in the 1970 animated film The Aristocats, produced by Walt Disney Productions. She was a mother cat with 3 kittens and so on. And then right over at the end, it says, so in summary, Duchess was the main mother cat character in the classic Disney animated film The Aristocats, set in the early 20th century Paris. Now, Claude 2 has almost certainly seen Black Beauty as part of its training data, but its initial response to my question is not related to Black Beauty, which is what I wanted to confirm. And let me go ahead and start a new chat and ask the question, who is Duchess? And I'm going to go ahead and paste the entire novel in the context window. And let's give this a couple of seconds. Now, that's pretty impressive. The response back from Claude 2 is, based on the contents of the book excerpt, Duchess seems to be the Black Beauty's mother, and some key details. And if I head over to the end, it says, so in summary, Duchess is identified as Black Beauty's mother, gives him advice when he is young, and distress when they're separated after Black Beauty is old, and so on. Now, it would have taken me over 3 hours to read this book, and here I can get my answer in just under a minute. All right, so we've looked at context lengths of large language models and how they vary from around 4,000 tokens for some models to 100,000 tokens. Go ahead and try and upload a large book or a knowledge base, anything that has less than 75,000 words, into Anthropic's Claude 2 model and query it. And post your findings on LinkedIn and tag me.